Hey, this is Matthew, and welcome back to Nerd News Today, and it's time once again for another Japanese pro wrestling figure review. Now, last time on our debut episode, I made the controversial choice to review Kenta Kobashi, who I think would probably have surprised many of you as being my first choice for a figure in the series, but he's my favorite guy, so that's why I went with him first. But it was a close second to who we're looking at today, and that is the legendary Antonio Inoki. Now, you can't talk about Japanese pro wrestling and not say Inoki's name in it. It's just impossible to do that. And Inoki is a guy that has had many figures of himself in different incarnations, sizes, and styles. And today I decided to look at one that's a little bit more unique because it's also one of the few Charapro figures to have a championship belt with him. So there were tons of championship belts, of course, in Japan and all the different promotions, but in terms of figures, there weren't a ton of them with belts. And in particular, this one here is a pretty obscure and interesting belt. It's got a pretty good story to it. I think it's worth talking about, and I think this also looks like a good looking piece of gold. So yeah, I'm really excited to chat about this one here today. The NWF Heavyweight Championship Belt. So this belt was originally part of the National Wrestling Federation, and it was actually a New York championship belt, believe it or not, that was originally made in 1970 by Pedro Martinez. So me being a New Yorker, this is basically a belt that's in my area. It's part of my turf, essentially. So how did this belt end up going from New York to Japan? Well, one of the champions and also co-founders of the NWF was Johnny Powers. And 3 years after the company debuted, Powers ended up selling the belt, believe it or not, to New Japan Pro Wrestling in '73. What that ultimately meant was he lost the belt to Antonio Inoki in kayfabe in that year, and Inoki would then carry that belt over into New Japan Pro Wrestling. And it's also safe to say that Inoki brought a lot more prestige to the belt than Powers did or anybody else did in New York, because he defended against some pretty big names including Stan Hansen and Andre the Giant. And he also held the belt 4 different times during a 10-year span. Basically, he held that belt for almost the entirety of that span, in fact. And that's not to say that the belt didn't have some people of note holding it during the time that was in America, which obviously included Johnny Powers, Dominic DeNucci, who a lot of folks will remember as Mick Foley's trainer, Ernie Ladd, Abdul the Butcher, and Johnny Valentine. In Japan, however, the belt was held several times, as we mentioned, by Inoki, as well as Tiger Jeet Singh, Stan Hansen. But in Japan, the belt was mostly held by Antonio Inoki, with the exception of Tiger Jeet Singh winning the belt when it was briefly vacated, and then later by Stan Hansen. But otherwise, this belt was primarily held by Inoki. But let's talk a little bit more about the belt once we get him out of the package. So the front of the package has a nice picture of Inoki. It looks like probably more towards the 80s of him wearing that NWF Championship belt. We can see the New Japan logo here on the top left corner here, and this is Superstar Figure Collection 23. And that number does not denote that this is from Inoki's line. This is the, I guess, pose of Inoki with the belt labeled as Figure 23, because Inoki would have this figure reused many other times without the belt. We see the Hyper Heroes logo down here in the bottom, and I really like that Inoki logo on the bottom as well. Back of the packaging here has a very big bio about him, which does talk briefly about the NWF belt as well. It's also got some of his statistics, and it lets us know this figure came out in 1999, so fairly early on into this line of this style of figures. But that's enough about that. Let's go ahead and take our Inoki out of the package and look at him loose. And here's our Antonio Inoki figure now out of the box, and it looks very good, just as good as I hoped it would look inside the packaging, if not even better. So this is like Inoki's famous grappling pose. I kind of make fun of it sometimes because it is a little silly looking and very old school, but you know what? It's totally Inoki. The pose is 100% him. And that head sculpt is also absolutely great. You know, they made a lot of figures of Inoki, and I don't think any one of them really looks that terrible. I think his face in particular, it's very toyetic. It's very cartoony, in some ways naturally just how it looks. Not to be an insult to him, but Inoki has a very distinct look, and this figure has totally captured how that face looks, and as well as his body. What's also kind of neat is that this isn't just a plain old black pair of trunks that he's wearing here. It's actually a little bit more of a brown maroon kind of color, I'd say. So I don't know if it's actually meant to be that color that it faded, but based on everything else in the package, I'd say that it didn't fade. It just is a different kind of color for him. And Inoki didn't really wear a ton of different things. Most of his colors were fairly simple, either red, black, sometimes other things. But in this case here, this is kind of brown color, and that's kind of interesting to me, that it's a figure of him in a different outfit than his typical iconic black. Antonio Inoki typically just wore black trunks, so I'm trying to remember what match he actually wore brown in. I couldn't really even find it on YouTube or anywhere else. But if anybody out there is like a super Inoki fan and knows when he wore this brown color, please let me know, because I absolutely need to know when he wore that. So in terms of articulation here, our Inoki has pretty much the same articulation as every Charapro or Charapro style figure has. The arms go up and down, and the waist should move, but let's see about that. Yeah, there we go. The waist has not been moved in like over 20 years, so there you go. That's about all he has for articulation, but that's pretty much what we have come to know and expect from these style of figures. Now, the main reason I wanted this Inoki versus many other styles of Inoki is because of that championship belt, that NWF title. So does the belt come off? Well, the answer is yes. It looks like it has just one simple little latch in the back. Let's see if it comes out though, because it's been on him for so many years. I'm a little afraid to actually pop it off because it might just destroy it, but let's see. It looks like it is supposed to come out. It's just the paint may have melted onto it, in fact. Here we go. No, all right, it's just very tight. Yeah, so the belt does come off just like that. Now you see it's just a plain basic Inoki figure, and again, this particular figure would be used many times again in the future to make other Antonio Inoki figures. And I think in fact there's like a few variants of him with different colored towels. In fact, he had like a red towel and a blue towel. So you know, this is a fairly reused figure of Inoki. The big key of this one here is that it's got that belt, and the belt looks really great. You know, one thing I can say about this particular version of the belt too is you can see that the gold is still stayed gold. A lot of Japanese wrestling figures in particular suffer from what collectors call the green disease, where the gold starts to kind of fade and run and mostly mutate from sunlight, where it turns greenish, and there's really nothing you can do to prevent it. So I'm lucky here that I got a really nice specimen of this belt where it's not green, it's just this nice gold. It stayed gold. There's these nice looking white bits in there that are kind of like this pearlescent color. So overall here, it's a fairly nice looking championship belt. And in terms of how to put it back on and off, it's just one hole in it. All you gotta do is just do that, and boom, it's back on him. So if this was a different wrestler, I could put it around his waist and it wouldn't look as awkward as it does here today. Maybe you can get it on this side and it'll look all right. Let's see. Yeah, that doesn't look too bad. Just a matter of getting it to stay in place, but that actually looks all right. Now our paint job on Inoki, besides his brownish looking trunks, I think it's also a very good paint job. It's got some good detail on the lips and the eyebrows. The boots are the shiny kind of leather black color with the white laces. He's got white soles as well. No pegs on the bottom of the feet, by the way. Most of these figures, if not all of them, do not have peg holes in their feet because they didn't really come with stands. And well, later on you'll see that some figures do have stands, but again, no pegs. They devised a different system to actually hold up the figures. That's pretty unique to Charapro and Charapro style figures. I also really like Inoki's hair. They've really captured his very unique hair, and it's some really good sculpting work as well on all of that. He had the giant sideburns and that kind of like pompadour hairdo. It's again very much Inoki. It really just is him, you know. They did a really perfect job capturing all those elements of him. I really like the hands and arms in this figure too. Now, as we mentioned, it is that kind of unique Inoki pose, but they really went out of their way to get some excellent anatomy on it to really capture, you know, the hunched over look of him, the back that he had. You know, he's a broad-shouldered guy, broad-chested man, but with kind of thinner legs. But a big part of his look has always been those grappling fingers, and you know, hands are always one of the hardest things to get, and they did a really nice job of getting those hands and fingers. I do wish there was maybe a little bit more paint detail on these figures, maybe just some paint on the fingernails would have been nice. I don't know, most figures don't really deal with that, but I feel like with how simple these figures are, and the fact that they painted the lips different color, you know, I feel like they could have just carried over that color onto the fingernails, but that's just me hoping for a little bit of extra for a figure that I'm already pretty happy with. Now, as I mentioned, this figure was recycled several times over again for other Charapro figures. One of them, in fact, we have here with us today, and that would be the bronze type of Inoki figure. We're going to do another video about bronzes another day, but this is just a quick look at the bronze type figure, quick comparison. Yes, that bronze figure also has the NWF title, but this would be really the main variant of the figure. Or rather the most different variant, because again, most other times it would just be a different towel, or maybe his trunks would have been black instead of this brown color. But we're going to spend many other days talking about Inoki figures because he had so many other versions of himself in the trunks, as well as without the trunks. Businessman Inoki is a whole other special thing that we're going to talk in depth about in the future, in addition to these bronze figures that we're looking at right now. And on that topic of figure variants, it actually kind of brings me up to the continuing history of the NWF title that we see right over here by Inoki's feet at the moment. So as I mentioned, you know, Inoki would hold that belt for many years, and he eventually retired it in 1981. And it would be about over 2 decades before Inoki brought the belt back, where a tournament was held for it, with the winner being Yoshihiro Takayama, in fact, and he defeats Yoshi Kosaka in a tournament to win the belt. And the reason I mentioned that in this part of the video is because there is another wrestling figure with this NWF title, and that is a Yoshihiro Takayama figure. It's a pretty sought after figure as well, in fact, and it's a good looking one too. So hopefully I'll get a hold of that toy one day as well. I don't have him right now in my collection, but that's the one I'm actually looking to get of Takayama. And in case you're curious, there was only one other wrestler to hold that belt in the modern era, and that would be Shinsuke Nakamura. He won the belt almost a year later to the day, and he unified it with the IWGP heavyweight title. At that point then nullified the NWF belt entirely, and it went bye-bye, because it's technically now merged with the IWGP title. So at the end of the day, this is a very good Inoki figure. You know, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways you can get this particular pose with Inoki, but I think it's worth hunting down to get the version with the NWF belt because it just looks so cool. And you know, I'm a championship belt whore, so I love to have these belts. And this one in particular is a really great, very unique looking title. So I recommend getting that version of Inoki with that belt here. It's got a really great sculpt, wonderful paint job, very clean across it, top to bottom. Good likeness, good anatomy, everything about this, as usual, they're just good figures, you know, and this is, I think, a very good Inoki that's extra iconic because it's got that championship belt with him. And surprisingly, because the NWF belt is really not that recognizable, not that memorable, this is one of the few figures of belts you can find for a pretty affordable price. So I definitely recommend getting this Inoki, and yeah, we're going to talk about a lot more Inokis in the future because, as I kept saying in this video, there's tons and tons of Inokis, so trust me, this series will not have a lack of Inoki anytime soon. So I'm Matthew, this has been Nerd News Today. If you liked what you saw here today, and I hope you learned something today about Japanese pro wrestling and Japanese wrestling figures, and if you liked what you saw here today, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel to see everything else we do here on Nerd News Today. And hey, don't forget to give us a thumbs up for this video if you liked what you saw here today. So until next time, thanks for watching, and keep that fighting spirit burning.